So welcome. So we're continuing what we did a couple of weeks ago, with the showing God's existence, and we're going to continue what we did the last time, but take a little twist on it, an argument by absurdity. If one denies God, then absurdity follows. And so what I'm going to do in this argument, this demonstration, is follow a prominent atheist philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre. And Sartre basically starts out with his first premise: God doesn't exist. In other words, he doesn't go through an elaborate refutation of God's existence. He just simply starts there, because the reasoning is very simple. If God existed, then I wouldn't be God. And there's not a lot of reasoning there. It's just simply that can't be. And what he sets out to do, and he's very clear about this, to make a coherent picture of the world in which God doesn't exist. In other words, since God doesn't exist, he's arguing, the world must be like this. And the picture that he paints of the world is a world that's absurd. A world that ought to produce nausea in a wise person. And he has actually a book called Nausea, in which the main character becomes progressively more nauseous as a habitual state. And that's he's the protagonist. In other words, that would be wisdom. And so in logic, in philosophy, you can make an argument that's called an argument by absurdity. It's granting a certain premise. If absurdity or contradiction results, what does that show you? Your premise is wrong. Either your premise is wrong or your reasoning is wrong. It's got to be one or the other. Right? So if absurdity follows, there was something wrong, either my premise or my reasoning. Okay, absurdity would be contradictory, basically. Some kind of contradiction. It could also be simply a meaninglessness. But that would ultimately be contradictory to all of our inclinations, which are for meaning. Right? So absurdity ultimately is contradiction. And so I'm drawing here on a work by Sartre called Letter on Humanism. It's a short work. He's marvelously clear compared to other philosophers. And he says himself that his existentialism is nothing more than an effort to draw all the consequences from a coherent atheist position. All right, so what does the world look like? The first step in his reasoning is, if there's no God, and for him, since there's no God, although he didn't prove that, then if there's no creator, then there wouldn't be natures. There can't be something such as human nature. Because a nature would imply a creator of that nature. In other words, if there's a plan in humanity, there would be a planner, a lawgiver. But he's precisely denying the lawgiver and the planner, and therefore there can't be a plan written in human nature. And I think we should all agree, he's absolutely right, that the plan and the planner have to go together. If there's a plan, that points to a planner. If there's no planner, how could there be a plan? If there's no creator, how could there be a nature? Now, a lot of the new atheists don't get this, and that's why I think it's fashionable. No, the new atheism, people like Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who recently passed away, and others of that type, they basically argue that we can be atheists and nothing else. Morality doesn't change. The Christian picture of the world hardly changes. We can have morality without God. We can have human nature without God, etc. Sartre, that's absurd. That can't be. If there's no creator, there's no nature. All right. First step. If there's no nature predefined, written in, if there's no plan, then what follows. We have to give a plan. We have to give a moral law. We have to put down the parameters. Right? If there's nobody else who put down parameters, then it's up to each individual human being to put down the parameters of our own existence. Right? Pretty much this is how much of society thinks. In other words, we have to define ourselves. And so he has a fancy way of saying that our existence is what's primary, and we define our own essence by our own choice. We know that we are, but that's utterly unaccountable, and it has no. It doesn't tell us anything, and everything that we live by is something that we choose. Nothing written in. In other words, there's no finality for man, right, if there's no creator, and there's no such thing, and there can't be such a thing as natural law. But we have to act. Right? We have to choose. And that's the terrible problem for him, is that we have to choose to do one thing rather than another. But we don't have any foundation for making that choice written in. There's no plan. In other words, there's no law of God that I can discover if there's no God. And therefore, there's no code of morality written in, and thus it would be up to each person to define it. But how are you going to define it? On the basis of what? Well, we would say on the basis of human nature. But he just said that there is none. And so there is no basis. Right? And so Sartre thinks that the coherent person has to recognize that there's no basis. But you still have to act and choose. And therefore, there's going to be something arbitrary about your acting and choosing. And that ought to unsettle a person. And therefore, the wise person is the person who feels deeply, profoundly unsettled. And it would be the fool. And he's pointing this argument points right to the new atheists. They're fools because they think that, sure, we can just cancel God and we've got a plan and there's morality and everything's the same. Yeah. But Sartre's more profound than them, even though he's more horrible in some sense because he's denying a morality. But he's more coherent, I think. So we have to choose this morality and this finality by a kind of absolute act of freedom based on nothing. And so in Sartre's system, if there's no God, he thinks, since there's no God, we have to exercise some kind of absolute act of freedom. And that ought to produce a kind of absolute anxiety in us. And he gets this from another philosopher named Heidegger, who talks about in German Angst. English anxiety doesn't quite translate Angst. And so Sartre takes it simply one step further, that Angst, that anxiety, would be in fact a kind of seasickness, because you're charting a course with no foundation. And therefore you ought to feel nauseous, as you would feel on a boat that's going back and forth with nothing solid. Right? Nothing to stand on.
How do you get out of bed?
Well, that's a problem. But there would be kind of a heroism. No, the heroism is to get out of bed anyway. Right? And he gets he's not the first one. Nietzsche in the 19th century basically has said the same thing. That there's you have all of this anxiety, you have to decide this unlimited freedom, and then the heroism of getting out of bed anyway. In other words, going forward anyway. Right? So it's a nausea from giving man too big a task. Right? An infinitely too big of a task to give a plan for the whole universe with no foundation and no basis. Right? So there's something attractive about this, because he's giving us this huge, colossal task. But of course, it's a task like that of Sisyphus. It's something that you can't possibly do. Right? So there's a crushing burden, and the crushing burden is to try and be God. So that's a very interesting thing. The profound atheist recognizes that if there is no God, I have to be God. And that's precisely what produces the nausea, because you're not God. And so the existentialist man knows that he didn't create himself. He was just plopped down into this world from nowhere for nothing, and yet he has to chart a course.
So where does he get his must and has to?
Well, that's the problem, right? There logically can't be anything prior. So it's a sheer imposition, I think, of a must and an ought.
You mean he just makes it up?
Okay, sure, right? But he would say absolutely he makes it. In other words, that's precisely what he would say. You have to make it up with no foundation.
Well, maybe he has to, but why do I?
Well, if you want to be a coherent atheist,
Or existentialist. Same thing, right?
Well, he's defining his. Not all existentialists are atheists, but Sartre is defining his brand of existentialism as an atheist existentialism. And it's obviously a more coherent version. All right, so the picture of man here is that we're thrown into this world without a plan. We're abandoned to ourselves, and we have to give a plan to all of existence. All right, so we're a kind of God, but a helpless God in some ways, and right? In other words, we have to give value to a world that doesn't have any value on its own. And I think any atheist would have to say this, if they're coherent, that we have to assign value. And that was very fashionable in the 60s and 70s and 80s. There was that, among psychologists, for example, EST, various movements of kind of self-help psychology, which tell you basically you have to define value. And therefore they would often draw the conclusion you have to recognize you're the supreme being in that sense. But two consequences. If we have to assign value, that means that there isn't any value prior to my assigning it. What does that say about my neighbor? Sorry, it says that you have no value unless I assign it to you.
And vice versa.
And vice versa. I don't know if that got thought out. But and so you can see, right, so by blowing up each person into this unlimited freedom, assigning value for neighbor, the world also becomes a clash of these unlimited freedoms. And so what limits my freedom? No plan of God, no nature, but there is something that limits my freedom. And what is that? Yours. And so in this context, one's neighbor becomes, in some sense, hell. And he ends one of his plays, No Exit, with this line. The character saying, so this is hell. I never ever believed it. You remember all we were told about the torture chambers, the fire and brimstone, the burning marrow? Old wives' tales, there's no need for red-hot pokers. Hell is other people. All right. So I think coming to this conclusion is sufficient to disprove it. Right? To show that this can't be. Because this ought to immediately provoke in us a response that Aristotle, in his Ethics, he says, what do you do with a person who doesn't simply disagree on a particular point of morality, but throws out the whole moral law? What do you do with him?
Kill him.
He says he needs not an argument, but a beating. And the reason why Aristotle says this is because no argument will work. Because all arguments about morality have to start with some moral principle. But if Sartre's starting from, if there's no God, there can't be a moral principle except one that I impose and one that you impose, and they're going to clash, and there's nothing that can arbitrate this. Dostoevsky has a famous line, if God doesn't exist, then everything is permitted. It's the same idea, but turned upside down. Right? Because Dostoevsky is making this argument to show, therefore, since we all know that not everything is permitted, and we know it more profoundly than we know anything else, then that shows that God exists. Right? Whereas Charlotte is really turning it the upside down. Since God doesn't exist, everything is permitted, but we're not going to say everything is permitted because I'm going to impose a morality, but I'm going to impose it without any foundation. Right, so we ought to be horrified by this vision. And that very horror shows us that there's an absurdity here that shows that there's either a problem with the reasoning we said or with the premise. And it seems that the reasoning is very good and much better than that of the new atheists. Therefore, the problem is our first premise that God doesn't exist. Right, so we could say it like this. He argues, if God doesn't exist, the world is absurd. Second, God, in fact, doesn't exist because, he doesn't explain, but because then I wouldn't be him. Third, therefore, the world is absurd. And wisdom is recognizing that, more or less. All right, but we ought to turn it around. We'll accept his first principle. If God doesn't exist, man and the world are absurd, but it's absurd to think that the world is absurd, and therefore that shows us that it's absurd to think that God doesn't exist. Right? And what are we doing? The basis of everything that we do in life is based on the conviction that the world's not absurd, because it's the getting up in the morning question. Everything that we do on the basis of purpose. Right? And a crisis of purpose is the greatest crisis that can happen to a person. This is beautifully developed by the psychologist Viktor Frankl. He's well known for his book, Man's Search for Meaning. He was in a concentration camp, already having reached this conclusion that the biggest problem psychologically in the 20th century isn't something about repression of libido, or not that he denied that such a thing could occur, but he thought that the principal psychological problem in modern man is a crisis of meaning, a crisis of purpose, leading to depression and vain attempts to fill that depression, irrational attempts to fill it. In other words, if there's a void of meaning, all of human life becomes impossible. And it simply shows us that everything that we do is predicated on hope, and therefore on the conviction that life does have a meaning, and that you can't subtract that without total absurdity. In other words, it's like there could be no greater incoherence than saying there's no purpose for human life, because there would be no purpose in saying that. Aristotle says that certain errors are so grave, just like the one we said before. Now somebody says there's no moral law, that you can't argue within philosophy against such a person, because their position, in a sense, is out of bounds. It's out of the bounds of any kind of argument. Well, saying that there's no meaning puts one out of the bounds of any discussion, ultimately. Okay. All right, so I'm going to shift gears now to a more positive note and do the same thing in reverse, positively. And talking about here, focusing on somebody else, Pascal. Pascal, in the 17th century, great apologist for the philosopher, but he's especially great, I think, for his Pensée, which is one of the great works of apologetics of the Christian faith. It's a bunch of fragments. It was never completed, but magnificent. By the way, there's a very fine edition of this by Peter Kreeft, with a marvelous introduction. So Pascal observed that the best argument, those arguments that actually work in practice, aren't the kinds of arguments that we've been giving up to now, but they're arguments that he calls arguments of the heart, rather than strict, rigorous philosophical demonstrations. That's not to say that rigorous philosophical demonstrations don't have value, as we said before. Right? They have great value in showing the reasonableness of faith, but they don't generally bring someone to accept and believe in God. Whereas the arguments of the heart do. So, first of all, what is an argument of the heart? This can be understood in different ways, but I take it to be an argument that touches on ultimately the experience of love. In other words, an argument that connects with the heart's own movement of love, and therefore there's an effective part to these arguments, which is what actually converts people. The way that they're formulated in people's minds is less rigorous, but if you analyze these arguments, they're saying the same thing as the arguments that we've done up to now, but skipping steps, because when the heart sees where it's going, you don't need all the steps. And these kinds of arguments can be done in different ways. Perhaps the most famous of them is that of St. Augustine. We could make an argument something like this. If God doesn't exist, then man's heart would be absurd, because everyone finds within themselves a desire for unlimited goodness and love. And that's what he expressed in those famous words at the beginning of his confessions. Our hearts were made for you and are restless until they rest in you. And that's simply the human heart can't rest in anything finite. Right? Everyone experiences this as they try to make it rest in finite things. And what happens? The more finite a thing you try and make your heart rest in, the briefer is the rest. And so one seeks to then accumulate another thing for the heart to rest in, and that leaves it even less satisfied. And so it actually, the restlessness of the human heart is best seen, I think, in a certain infinite attempt to fill it with finite things. And so a person achieves a certain income, and that's not enough, and they need another and more, and no matter how much you get, it seems people are not satisfied. And the same thing happens in every addiction. Whereas that, oddly or interestingly, doesn't happen in the world that's in brute animals. And a brute animal is content with what he's made for. Right? So the sparrow is content with one nest and doesn't seek to multiply them at the same time. And universally in the animal kingdom, an animal comes to rest in the particular good to which he has a natural inclination. So why doesn't man do that? And that's simply because of man's nobility. Because we have an intellect, that intellect can grasp the universal. And so everyone who gets the age of 3 can grasp the universal good. And that universal good extends to all that's good. And no finite good is the whole good. And so it's impossible for a human being who grasps the good to be satisfied by any finite good. It's impossible for someone who grasps love to be satisfied by a finite love. It's impossible for someone who grasps beauty, and that's every human being, to be satisfied by a particular beauty. Right? And that's why when people get some beautiful thing, they have to then rush out and get another beautiful thing. Because the first one can't satisfy a human being. Right? So everyone has this experience. Some have it. The more we seek to satisfy the heart in that way, the more we have this experience of the insufficiency. All right. And therefore, it comes back to what we were saying with regard to Sartre. If there is no good, with a capital G, infinite good, in which we can come to rest, then the human heart would be in vain. What does that mean, in vain? Something is said to be in vain if it has no purpose, if it has no end. In other words, an inclination that has no fulfillment is in vain. And again, in the animal world, we never find that. If there's a natural inclination in eagles to soar, well, they have wings. And it would be absurd. I mean, it can happen in an individual. An individual eagle can have a broken wing and be unable to soar. But it would be absolutely absurd if eagles all wanted to soar and weren't provided with wings. Obviously, I mean, it's not even thinkable. And somebody might reach, well, we couldn't know it. But it seems that doesn't happen in nature. Right? Where nature gives an inclination, and that goes together with the possibility of attainment for the species as a whole, if not for every individual. Right? And so it would be totally absurd if every human heart was built for infinite good, and there simply is no infinite good. That would be a contradictory world, because we would be provided for with the most marvelous thing, an inclination to the universal good. And there would be no good that corresponds. Right? That can't be. In other words, it comes in these arguments by absurdity, you have to assert your common sense. Right? In other words, you have to say at a certain point, that can't be. And that's health. And this, right, that's what happened with St. Augustine. No, that can't be. And that's, of course, what Sartre should have said. That can't be. Let's take another form of this. We often see that people, when they think in the abstract, say about morality, sexual morality, they make terrible, colossal mistakes. Right? They think that things are okay that are abominable. But when it's a discourse about their daughter, it looks entirely differently. They know perfectly well that is disastrous, right? That is wrong for their daughter. Why is that? Because they love their daughter. And that love enables them to see something that they ought to have seen in the abstract, but failed to, precisely because they were simply in the abstract. In other words, they weren't using the resources that we actually have in our common sense. Right? And so the same thing can work here. In other words, we can see, all right, maybe I'm missing myself, that I have this desire for this infinite good and I can't come to rest unless I rest in Him. Maybe I don't see that in myself. But if I love somebody else, truly, it can be easier to see in that person that they would be in vain if there is no God. No, and this is our conversion story, that of Marcia and I. I've told this. I'll just tell the story. We were living in Italy doing sculpture, and Marcia was pregnant with our son, and she had she fell into a very profound anxiety, which was unreasonable. And at a certain point, she said, "I don't want to live." And that now she says later she didn't mean that. She doesn't even remember that, but I didn't know that, and so. That hit me and enabled me to see that I hadn't been able to provide meaning for her existence. And that I couldn't do this. And the more she needed to be filled, the more I had an instinct to run away from trying to fulfill that. And so it hit me that day, if there isn't God the Father, who does love us infinitely and unconditionally, then life simply doesn't make any sense. For the same reason. We would all have this infinite need to be loved, infinite inclination to give ourselves totally and receive in return, and no one would be able to do it. And if that could be in some abstract world like Sartre's philosophy, it couldn't be in her. Right? In other words, that's why the arguments of the heart are so good, because loving somebody else enables you to come to a conclusion that you ought to have been able to come to, but by not making it personal, one would miss. In other words, when you love somebody, you won't accept that their existence is absurd. And that was the problem we said with Sartre. His philosophy makes love impossible. Right? And that's the best refutation. John Paul II, in so many places, his first encyclical was Redemptor Hominis. Man, I think it's number 10. The human being is made for love. To give himself in love and receive another. And if he doesn't find love, his existence is frustrated. Right? He experiences that what he's made for has been rendered vain. Right? That's the argument of the heart. Because that love with a capital L can't come from another limited human being. Right? But can only come from a lover with a capital L who can love without limit. Or another way to put it is, when you love another person, you can see that they're made in the image of God. In other words, you see that there's a goodness there that isn't a finite good. In other words, it can't be summed up with other finite goods. Right? That's the very experience of loving another person, is seeing them as an incommensurable good. But what does that mean, to be an incommensurable good? Only God is incommensurable. And so seeing another person that way is precisely seeing that man is made in the image of God. Right? That's what that means in its most profound level, that man's made it. There's a goodness in man that is a participation in the unlimited goodness of God. And so there's a worthiness of being loved in every human person that doesn't make any sense if there is no God. And which couldn't be, which, again, Sartre's philosophy wouldn't allow for. And that's where we should protest. Well, that can't be. Or to put it another way, if there is no God, then there would be no providence over the world. In other words, there would be no reason for our coming into the world and going out of the world. But again, that would be the same as saying, this person that I love has no real value, except some value that I attach to them, but they don't have it from themselves. Right? And again, we want to say that can't be. Right? Pope Benedict comes back to this many times when he makes reference to evolution. And so he says that it's totally impossible to think that, or let me put it stronger still, if there's no plan at the origin of our existence, right, then human life would be meaningless. Right? We would simply be blind atoms in a blind flux. And everyone's experience of life from the beginning to the end is the sufficient refutation of that. In other words, what we're saying is that it's not necessary to prove everything. Right? It's only let me even go a step back. Aristotle in his Logic has a great line. It's only the fool who seeks to prove everything. Why? Because if you seek to prove everything, what would you be doing? You'd be proving there would be nothing on the basis of which you could prove. That there would be no foundation. And wanting to prove everything would be trying to build without any foundation. And so there have to be certain things that we simply see without proof. Right? So what is one of those things that we see without proof? Well, one of them is the dignity of the human person. Right? That's our first principle. Another is that the world is not in vain. That's a first principle. Another is that there is a moral law, the golden rule. And that's a first principle. Now, all of these first principles are what you build on. And so the experience of love helps one to see the first principles on which we build. Right? That the human person has a dignity which ultimately is a participation of another. And that the human person is for that other. And that other loves us infinitely. Okay, let's try and sum up the various arguments that we've given up until now. So I'm going to give a summary here of the 5 ways and then the ways that we gave today. So 3 weeks ago, we looked at, 3 and 4 weeks ago, the 5 ways of St. Thomas. And each one of these ways uncovers a different aspect of God by looking at a different aspect of the world as a means to getting to God. Right? So having many different ways to prove that God exists is very helpful because it reveals far more about who God is and more also about what the world is. And so in the first way, we started with movement in the world. And we said that there has to be a first mover of all movement, a first source of all movement that isn't himself moved. In other words, there's got to be a mover who doesn't move in moving. Yeah. And that's God. In other words, there's got to be a first source of all activity. Right? And that tells us something about God. It tells us that He's, in philosophical language, pure act, pure actuality, and in no way moved, in no way passive. In the second way, we looked at the world and we saw in the world there's causality. There are things that cause other things. And there are chains of causes, of things causing other things. But that provokes the question, well, what's the first source of all the causality? In other words, what's the first source of the power to do things? And that first source has to be a cause of causes that is uncaused. So again, it's very similar to the first. There's got to be a first source, not only of movement, but a first source of all power to move things. And that will be God. All right, so these are showing God's omnipotence. The third way, which we went through too quickly, showed that there had to be, and we looked at the world and we see that things are contingent. They're here for a time and they end. And we said there has to be something necessary, and there has to be something that's necessary from itself, that simply is of itself. And we said that corresponds to what God said to Moses, I am. Right? Necessary being. The fourth way was more difficult, but it gave a better, more profound result. In the fourth way, we looked at grades of being, and we saw that whatever aspect you're looking at, goodness, truth, beauty, unity, we see grades of it. Anything that's a perfection that doesn't imply any limitation, we see grades, and we said that there must be a first. That's the source of the others, because these grades are grades of participation, having something in part. We have goodness in part, we have beauty in part, we have truth in part, and some more, some less. And therefore there has to, and we're all participating in goodness, truth, beauty. There must be a source of what is participated. And that would be beauty with a capital B. That would be goodness with a capital G. Truth with a capital T. No? And so when Jesus says at the Last Supper, I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? He's saying he is precisely that first truth, that first life, which we participate in. Right? And so this shows us something more about God. It shows us that he is, that whatever perfection we find here, he is that perfection without any limitation. So whatever goodness we find, he is that. Whatever beauty, whatever truth, personhood, he must be that. Love, he must be that. Communion, he must be that. In other words, whatever we find that is a perfection that doesn't imply any limitation, he's got to be it. Right? And so that reveals far more to us about who God is. And then the fifth way was the way by order. And looking out in the world, we see that things are ordered and they move to ends. And everything, there's not anything in the world that doesn't have a natural inclination to some proper end for it. Even the rock goes not just randomly, but to the center of the gravitational field. And much more do we find that in the higher we go in the level of being. Right? In animals and much more in man. And so if all creatures move to ends, and ends that they don't know, that points to a lawgiver. In other words, if there's, and not just a lawgiver, but every lawgiver who's the original lawgiver must be intelligent. No, because law is ordering means to ends, and that's the work of intelligence. And so the whole world shows the most marvelous ordering of parts to means to ends, inclinations to ends, and therefore that shows us an intelligence that has planned the whole. And that's why we can speak of a natural law, not just in rocks and birds that fly south in the winter, but we can speak of a natural law in the human heart. Right? Precisely what Sartre had to deny, since he said there is no God. Right? And so from law, whether it's in the irrational world or whether it's the natural law written on the human heart in conscience, all of that points to a lawgiver, right, who has marvelously ordered this world. And that, again, tells us more about God, because it tells us that he exercises a providence over everything, and that he has a plan that reaches to everything. Right? Finite intelligences, like human beings, order certain things, but only those things that fall within our sphere of activity. Right? So our instruments, our technology. But if the whole of creation is ordered by a lawgiver, nothing will escape that plan. In other words, it'll be a plan that governs the hairs on our head and every human action, right? And again, that's precisely what Jesus reveals in the gospel when he says, all your hairs are counted, right? The sparrow doesn't fall on the ground without God the Father being, without his providence. So in all these ways, we see a marvelous harmony of what reason can know rightly working and what is revealed by God himself, right, in salvation history. And then finally, in the arguments, the reasons of the heart, we find the same thing, but centering on the human person and the experience of human dignity, love, and the fact that we're made for something infinite. Right? And that shows us, again, more about God, that he is that infinite lovableness and that infinite lover. Okay, now I'm going to pause for a second and take up the objections against God's existence. And St. Thomas, in his the article that we've been following, the 5 ways to show that God exists, he surprisingly gives only 2 objections, because he didn't, I suppose, he gives lots of arguments because they're very useful, but I don't think he thought that atheism was a significant problem, because he only gives 2 objections, but they're great objections. And they're the objections that everyone gives. And so we have to know how to answer them. Right? And of course, the first and most important is the problem of evil. If God exists and is truly perfect, the perfect goodness that we said, the perfect providence that we said, the omnipotent power that we said, well, how is it possible that such a creator would be the author of this world in which it seems there's so much imperfection? And I get a chance to practice answering this question every weekend when I see my in-laws. The conversation almost always comes down to this.
You ever win?
No. But of course, it's not only they who ask. Every reasonable person ought to ask this. Right? So this is the great objection. If God is what we've said he must be, how is it that there's so much evil in the world? Right. The best way to answer this is first look at the evil in the world and make a sort of catalog of the evil of the world, right? So that we know what we're talking about. So the first distinction is physical evil and moral evil. Right? Physical evil being, and all of this evil being a lack, but not simply a lack of what ought to be. Right? That's the evil that people are rebelling against or suffering from. The lack of what ought to be there. Right? That's what hurts. Not simply a lack, but the lack of what ought to be. Right. And we experience that on so many levels. So the 2 principal levels, the lack of what ought to be there in the body, physical evil, and the lack of what ought to be there in the soul and in the human will, moral evil. All right, so let's start with the let's dwell on this just a minute more. So it's a key to answering this question, seeing that evil is precisely a lack of what ought to be. In other words, it doesn't have a positive nature. And that's very important. Evil is a pure parasite. The greater the good that ought to be there, right, the greater the evil. And therefore, evil always points to, and can't help but point to, good, right? Because it's the lack of the good that ought to be there. And therefore, the more we feel outraged by the existence of evil in the world, what are we actually saying? We're saying that there ought to be a great good. And I'm outraged or revolted or in deep pain because the good that ought to be there is lacking. And so every recognition of evil implies a prior recognition of good. Right? And what kind of good? The good of the subject. This is so important because this will connect to our reasons of the heart. So my father-in-law it's a magnificent thing when people get very worked up over the evil in the world. Because what does it mean? It means that they're sensitive to that evil and that they sympathize very greatly with the one suffering that evil. And therefore, there's a recognition of the great good that ought to be there. And that, in some sense, they think deserves to be there, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be outraged over its lack. And therefore, there's a recognition in the recognition of the problem of evil, of the dignity of the human person. Precisely that dignity that made us recognize that it could only have its foundation in God. And therefore, a profound perception of evil points right back to God. No? Because it wouldn't have been evil if we just plopped into this world by chance. There wouldn't be such an evil in the corruption of something that had no purpose. Right? There's only a recognition of evil when we recognize it's the corruption of something that has great purpose. But if it has great purpose, what does that say? So I think it's important to point that out at the start. That in other words, in having this kind of conversation with a non-believer, it's helpful, I think, to say that you appreciate where they're starting from, and that there's something very noble in where they're starting from. And it would be terrible if they weren't outraged about evil, because that would imply a more incurable problem, right? If someone isn't outraged about evil, it would be because they're not recognizing the good that ought to be there. And then with such a person, I don't know that you can do anything. But with the person who recognizes and is indignant about that evil, then you can do something further. All right, so that'd be the first step. All right, so then let's break it down: physical evil and moral evil. So, granted that we all experience there's an incredible amount of physical evil in the world, how could that be compatible with an omnipotent, infinitely good, totally provident God? And so the question would be, is there a goodness in the permission of physical evil? And I think it's not at all hard to see yes. And so I'm going to take a step back further, and let's look at this from God's point of view. And this is a very helpful thing to do in theology as much as one can, right? To look at things from the God perspective. So God, in creating the world, what is He seeking to do? He's seeking to communicate a share of His goodness, right? And why? Simply because He's good. Goodness is diffusive itself. God, being infinitely good, wants to share and communicate that goodness. And how much do you suppose He wants to communicate it? As much as it can be communicated. And therefore, God's plan, it would seem, ought to be to communicate goodness on all the levels of good. And therefore, an infinitely good, infinitely generous God wouldn't want to only create one level of good, but would want to create all the levels of good. In other words, all the different participations. So far, so good? All right. What would that mean? To create all the participation means to create goods, some goods that are incorruptible, spiritual beings, physically incorruptible, in other words, that can't die, that can't lose their being, and that would be angels. Right? So God, in creating angels, has created a whole series of beings that have a level of goodness that is such that they can't lose the goodness of being. They can lose their moral being, but they can't lose their nature and their physical being. But God wants to create all the levels of good. And so it seems fitting that He wouldn't want to be satisfied with only some good and not all the levels. And so below the angels there are other levels of good that by their very nature are goods that are temporarily possessed, that are possessed for a time. And so it's a better world, a world with more good, that there be not only beings that can never lose that good of being, but that there are other beings that are good, but are good for a time. And those are bodies. Right? That's the reason for the physical universe, is so that there can be beings that have another level of goodness, a goodness that is here today, but is gone tomorrow, but which gives rise to another being, which is here today, but gone tomorrow, which gives rise to another. In other words, that's also a kind of good. So in the physical world, physical evil is built in as a necessary limitation to that particular kind of good, distinct from the angelic good, or distinct from the good of a human soul, which is also spiritual and belongs to the spiritual world of things that once made can't lose their being.
So disease then is another level of good.
Sure, it's certainly a good, again, depending on the kind of it. Let's take a simpler example, the predator. Right? So the lion eating the deer, that's a good for the lion, and it's something built in for the deer. because it has a kind of good that is for a time. And its purpose is precisely to bring about the preservation of the whole species. And so each individual deer is different than an individual human being. In other words, a spiritual being, precisely because the spiritual being is forever, is for himself and not simply for the species. But a deer, a dog, a horse, can't be a good that is for himself in the way that a human person is. He's for the good of his species. And therefore each one's death is part of the natural order. Right? And it's a good natural order. Even though it's not good for the horse to die at this time, it's good for the common good of the whole universe. Right? So there's no problem here for an intelligent, omnipotent, all-good God in creating a world in which there's physical evil. Because that physical evil makes possible that particular level of good. And we would need more time to flesh this out. Maybe I'll do this next time. There's a fundamental principle. God doesn't allow, Chesterton says this very well, God doesn't allow evil to kidnap the universe. In other words, or to put it another way, God prefers a universe in which there are all the levels of good, even though that makes possible various kinds of evil. Right? Because he's making everything for the sake of the good. And we said that evil is all predicated on the recognition of the good subject. In other words, and we feel badly about the evil precisely because we recognize the goodness of the one undergoing and so it would not be a benefit for the universe if God, in order to not allow such evil, didn't make a physical universe. Right? That wouldn't be a benefit. God, yes, could make a world in which there's no physical evil. Very easy. Just make angels. But that wouldn't be such a beautiful creation. And maybe the best way to think about it is a symphony. In a symphony, the beauty of the symphony lies in the fact that it's not just the first violinist. Right? But the beauty of the symphony comes from the fact that there's a collaboration of many different kinds of sounds. Some sounds are more noble. The violinist's sound is more noble than that of the triangle or the percussionist. But the triangle adds to the beauty of the symphony. All right. That level of being that has being for a time and then loses that being, that's an instrument in the symphony. And if that weren't there, the whole symphony would lack a manifestation of the divine goodness that only that kind of participation can give. In other words, what we're saying is this. God has wanted to make a universe with many levels of good. Why? Because no one level of good is good enough to manifest Him. How much does it fall short? Infinitely, right? And so St. Michael falls infinitely short in manifesting God. And so the universe is better in which, in addition to St. Michael, there's Fido the dog. Even though Fido the dog only lives 20 years. And there's the warthog. It's a better world. And there's also even bacteria. And it does its own thing. And viruses, etc., etc. In other words, it's a better world in which... All right, so this is one part of the answer. I'm going to run out of time. But this answer is valid for the world below man. What about man? We know from Revelation that's what we just said isn't the whole story for man. Because man is this bizarre creature because he's at the crossroads of the two worlds that we mentioned. So having a spiritual soul that's incorruptible and then having a material body that is naturally corruptible. So it's a beauty. So we might say, okay, maybe man shouldn't exist. God shouldn't have created this. Well, if God didn't create man, then there would be lacking precisely the meeting place of the two levels of creation, the spiritual and the material. And so man is at the crossroads of the whole. But human nature is such that we've got an immortal soul and a mortal body. Man's naturally mortal, but his soul is naturally immortal. And so the problem of evil takes on a special role, or special, obviously, it's the principal question about evil is man. Right. We know from Revelation that God's plan wasn't simply to make man at this crossroads and allow his soul to do its thing and his body simply to do its thing, and that be that. But that God from the beginning gave to man's body a certain capacity to be elevated to share in things proper to his soul in Eden. And this brings us also to another fundamental principle that governs the human world and the angelic world, the spiritual world. That the spiritual creature is set apart from the other creatures because the spiritual creature is capable of participating in the infinite good. Now, that was our reasons of the heart. We said that we find in the human heart this capacity and this desire to give ourselves totally and be loved totally. And that another creature can't do that. Right, so the rational creature, human beings and angels, are such that they're made to, they're capable of God. But it's fitting that God wants to maximize good. And so he wants to add another level of good, that the rational creature reach that end. How? By his own participation. What does that mean? That there be an additional good that is merit. And merit being precisely a cooperation with God in reaching one's own end. But what does that imply? That great good of that capacity to cooperate with God in reaching the end means that there could be the voluntary, since it's a free cooperation, there could be a free non-cooperation. And that makes possible moral evil. But it's very, very wise to make a world in which that good of merit exists, even though it means that moral evil will also exist. And the key principle here, St. Thomas answered this much more simply than I have. He simply says, in a few words, that God is so good that he's capable of bringing out of every evil an immensely, immeasurably greater good. And so God permits evil. Why? Only to bring about an immeasurably greater good. And his wisdom is shown that he does this on every level and in the most unexpected way. And so Adam's sin was permitted for the sake of a good. No, and the good was responsibility. Moral responsibility is a stupendous good. But what does moral responsibility imply? That we're responsible for others. Right? That's a stupendous good. Headship. So what God has in himself, headship for the whole universe, he gives a share of that headship to each one of us in different measures and ways. And in particular, more to some than others, and Adam a lot. The head of mankind. And so that great good of headship means that one could be unfaithful to that headship. And that there would be real consequences. Otherwise, there would be no responsibility. And so those real consequences, when you look at them, are a good. Because they're the good of a real responsibility having been given. And the same thing goes for each one of us, every parent, every teacher, every priest, every head, in whatever order of things. That things are given to whoever exercises headship, not only for oneself, but for others. And if we're unfaithful, who suffers? Our neighbor, right? Those who are dependent on us. But it's not a good that they suffer. But that moral responsibility is a stupendous good, without which all the levels of good wouldn't have been realized in the universe. Right? And that's actually a higher level of good than any other. Because it's a good of charity. It's the good of being entrusted with our neighbor.
So there would have been suffering though without the fall.
Sure, there would be physical suffering in the world. But man would have been exempt, it seems, from the account of Genesis, from physical suffering, if he had been faithful to God. But the physical world would have had it. In other words, the world below man.
But it seems there would have been moral suffering as a result of the freedom, right? Even without the fall, right?
Sure. In other words, a lack of an abuse of that responsibility would have, and moral evil is a much greater evil than physical evil.
But in the normal
Mhm.
meeting, before the fall,
Before the fall, there was no sin that would have caused such an evil.
what?
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying, there wouldn't have been moral evil until they made
Sure.
the fall.
Sure. In other words, the moral evil would be precisely that which interrupts the covenant with God. But if it hadn't been interrupted earlier, it could have been interrupted later. And so God is able to make use of that evil for greater good. How do we see that? So here's the question. Are we better off after the fall, or would we have been better off before the fall? And the answer is we're better off in so many ways after the fall. And the church sings this in a very solemn way at the Easter Vigil when the deacon in the Exultet sings, "O happy fault that merited for, or that brought down for us so great a Redeemer, Jesus Christ." In other words, the remedy that God had provided, the incarnation and the passion of Christ, is an immeasurably, and here all words fall short, immeasurably greater good than all human evil. Physical evil or moral evil is bad. And that good is such that it enables the very evils to be means of participating and sharing in that good. In other words, that good that is Christ's Sacred Heart, right, that's the good that's greater than all evil is bad. That good is a shareable good in the sense that, it's the principle of cooperation. God wants all the levels of good, and He wants the good that is Christ's redemption to be shared, and that's co-redemption. But co-redemption implies sharing in the cross. And therefore, in order for there to be this great good of co-redemption, there has to be a sharing in the cross of Christ. In other words, love is shown by being loving to the end. In other words, loving through sacrifice. The sacrifice is not, in other words, the pain isn't the point. The point is that love is proved by the willingness to undergo sacrifice for the beloved. Right? And so, I'm going to leave it here because we've run out of time. But maybe we'll say something more about this next time.